Do a lot of work with the Center for Social Innovation here, so I'm passionate about the social sector, and I appreciate especially people like you who are willing to volunteer time and expertise for these organizations. They're doing important things, but they can benefit from the background that you have as a business person, and that's a great relationship. So thank you for doing that. What I'm going to talk to you about for a few minutes this morning is a set of ideas about how to make your ideas more successful. And this may apply to the project that you're working on. We're going to talk about a phenomenon towards the end of the presentation that is going to tell you why it's going to be really difficult, even though you have lots of expertise that could be relevant for the organizations that you're dealing with, why it's going to be difficult to get that message across to people in the organizations. And in fact, there's a great irony that says that wherever in life we are good enough to actually solve important problems in a field, we are going to be most ineffective at communicating our solutions to others. And so I'll talk about that. I'll talk about that at the end. But basically, this is a presentation about how to make your ideas stick. I hope that it will be useful to you in your work environment, in your volunteer activities. But to get into it, let me start by talking about a fairly unusual example of ideas sticking. How many of you have heard that statement? You only use 10% of your brain.
No personal.
No personal. Who ran this research study? Right? I mean, the brain is actually a very delicate, very costly organ. If you weren't only using 10% of it, the rest of it would have withered away a long time ago. You know, if this were true, brain damage would be a much less serious problem. You can imagine a cop show where the police officer saying, "Ma'am, I'm sorry, your husband took a bullet to the skull. But luckily, it only passed through the 90% of his brain that he wasn't using." All right? This is ludicrous, but it propagates very successfully in culture. It has a market share above, I think, 90% among this very distinguished group of people. Here are a few more. The Great Wall, it turns out, is not the only man-made structure that is visible from outer space. This one actually fooled me until somebody pointed out that the Great Wall of China is indeed very long, but it's also relatively thin. So if you could see it from outer space, you could also see any 8-lane freeway in Los Angeles. Ozzy Osbourne denies biting the head off of a live bat during a rock and roll concert. And for those of you that remember this far back, little Mikey from the old Life cereal commercials, the kid that wouldn't eat anything nutritious except for Life cereal, did not in fact die from an overdose of Pop Rocks and Coca-Cola. These are all bogus stories, but I want you to think about the last time it was important for you to get a message across. And I want you to think about a situation where it was important for you to make an idea stick with somebody else. That means that they understood what you were saying, that they could remember it later on, and that they could act on it. It changed the way that they thought about the world or the way that they acted in the world. So that's the definition of sticking. Now, there are lots of situations where we need to make our ideas stick. And what I want to suggest is that sometimes we aren't as successful at sticking our important ideas as these kind of trivial things about you only use 10% of your brain or Ozzy Osbourne and the bat. Those are in some ways more successful than we are at sticking our most important ideas. There are some complications. Your ideas may need to persist so that you can walk out of the room and people can still understand what you said and respond to it later on. Important ideas also have to cross boundaries. You are consulting for an organization. You're coming from a different perspective on life than the people that you're working with. That's a boundary that your ideas have to cross. Even within organizations, in Detroit, the people who design cars don't speak the same language as the people who manufacture the cars. And those manufacturing people speak a very different language than the finance people that fund the cars. And so even within the boundaries of a single organization, there are important sub-boundaries that ideas have to cross. Now, what I want to suggest is that there's kind of a curious prototype for thinking about if we want to understand how to make our messages stick. I want to suggest that urban legends are not a bad place to start. Number one, they persist over time. So that story about you only use 10% of your brain, you may think that that's a relatively modern example of our fascination with neuroscience. I mean, we can't open up a magazine today without seeing a picture of a brain and, when somebody's thinking about something and what parts of the brain are lighting up. But it turns out that there are a set of folklorists that have studied urban legends like this. And the earliest example that we can find of the you only use 10% of your brain idea is in a discussion of the World's Fair in 1924 in this country. Right? So for over 80 years, that idea has persisted in this culture. It turns out that urban legends also cross boundaries. And so that idea about you only use 10% of your brain, I had the opportunity to speak to a group of people from Malaysia a few months back. And I was a little worried about giving this presentation because I knew these urban legends were widespread in this culture, but I didn't know if they had made it to Malaysia. And so at the cocktail party, before I was talking to them, I kind of was trying some of them out. And I said, have you heard this? You only use 10% of your brain? And they said, oh, yeah, we know that one. And then I tried a more obscure one. So one of the things that I sometimes talk about is a legend that happens in this country about picking up a hitchhiker on a deserted road. And later on, that hitchhiker vanishes under mysterious circumstances. And through a chain of events, you find out that the person you picked up lived at an address where there was a person who died on that road 20 years before. All right? So you've encountered a ghost. It's a modern-day ghost story. And this is a fairly obscure urban legend, I thought. And I started telling it, and they started laughing, and they said, oh, yeah, we know that one, too. In fact, in Malaysia, it's well known that if there's a hitchhiker on the road, before you pick them up, you should look to see whether their feet are touching the ground. And if their feet aren't touching the ground, you don't pick them up, which is a good piece of advice. So notice that that's a story that has crossed really central cultural boundaries. I mean, you might not have thought that the same idea that captivates people's attention in North America and the United States would captivate people's attention in a very different cultural setting. But really effective stories, really effective truths, really effective proverbs very often cross cultural boundaries. All right. Let me point out that urban legends don't have a lot of the advantages that some of your ideas have. They don't have newspaper coverage, advertising budgets, the attention of top management, blogs, newsletters, or podcasts, or the assistance of PR professionals. And yet they survive and spread on their own. So what I want to give you today are 6 hints to make your ideas as successful as urban legends. What I'm going to be talking about to you is the content from a book that's coming out in January. I wrote this with my brother Dan, who's 10 years younger, so it's a bit of a family project. This is the final cover. I have copies of the book in the special limited edition black album that I will be passing out. I don't have quite enough for the people in this room. So let me ask that people who are not normally around campus, I know some of you are around campus, I can get you a copy later. When I pass these out later, leave these for the people who aren't on campus on a daily basis. But this is stuff that will be coming out in January. And there are 6 hints that we talk about in the book. Urban legends are simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional stories. And if you notice, there's a little logo embedded in there. So this is the framework for thinking about urban legend style success. First point, urban legends are simple. Now, it turns out that there are another class of ideas that are not naturally sticky, they're actually designed. But they're designed for a very complex task. And they have this characteristic of being simple. If you think about the task of making a movie, it's an incredibly difficult feat. If you've ever sat there in the theater and watched the credits scroll up at the end of a movie, there are actors and actresses and composers and set designers and best boys and key grips, whatever those things are. So there are a lot of different professions with different backgrounds that have to come together to make what is hopefully a coherent artistic product. Now, even before you get permission to make a movie, there is another boundary that your message has to cross, and that's the boundary between the artistic people who are making the movie and the finance people at the studios who fund the movies. And there's a phrase in Hollywood for the kinds of pitches that they make to get permission to make movies and to guide the artistic vision later on. I call it high concept. This is a simple, short description of the movie. It's very often in the form of an analogy. And that's how you make your pitch. That's how you get your money. That's how you keep people on track as different professions are working together towards a movie. So let me give you a test. Suppose that you wanted to pitch the movie that would become Alien. You want to do a really scary science fiction movie. All right? Now, in the past, those two genres were not often crossed. And when they did, they ended up with things like Godzilla Eats New York, which are, kind of science fiction horror comedy. But that's not what you're going for. You're trying to make a really scary science fiction movie. How do you pitch? What's the high concept for that movie? Jaws on a spaceship. All right? Now, that's a simple idea. Let me ask you some questions about it. First, if you're a finance person in Hollywood, do you want to fund this movie? Probably. Jaws was one of the most successful movies of all times. All right, so first question down. Second, we have two alternatives for showings of the completed movies. One is a nice pre-Christmas, pre-holiday season slot. The other is a summer introduction. How many of you want the pre-Christmas holiday season? All right, so another good decision made based on a very simple message. Here's a more difficult question. How important is your composer going to be for Jaws on a spaceship? Probably pretty. I mean, 83% or so of the thrills in Jaws were not seeing the shark. In fact, once the shark appeared, it was actually a little bit disappointing. But that theme, when the boat is out in the ocean, it was dun 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 dun. You need a good composer for this movie. And here's the final question. This is a master's level question, but all of you qualify. You need a set designer for Jaws on a spaceship. There happens to be a former set designer for the Star Trek television series that is available to you in your movies. Has a lot of experience with science fiction, has a lot of experience with science fiction sets. Do you want the Star Trek television designer? No. You guys are more negative than most audiences. I would suggest that you're right. I mean, there is no lint in the Star Trek universe. Everything works perfectly in the Star Trek universe. Those little doors go all right? 90% of the thrills in Jaws were the fact that they were in the middle of this vast ocean in this rickety boat, which at any moment could disintegrate, and in fact did over the course of the movie. And so if you've got the Star Trek designer doing those beautiful, lintless, well-working sets, that's not going to capture the fear of being trapped on a spaceship that itself is maybe falling apart with a scary creature. Right? Now, notice that all of that information, all of those decisions that you just made, were made with a very simple idea. It happened to be a really important core idea for the people who are constructing this movie, but very simple messages, if they're the right simple messages, can be extraordinarily powerful. Now, why are simple messages important? It turns out that there's a phenomenon called decision paralysis that all of you know about, but let me show you how important decision paralysis can be. Get a group of college students and ask them to imagine that they have an evening already planned. So they're going to go to the library for a couple of hours and study for some courses they need to study for, and later on in the evening they're going to hang out with some friends. But as they're walking across campus to the library, they see a sign, an advertisement for a speech that very evening, one evening only, with a speaker that they've always admired. And so now the choice comes, do I continue on my plan for my evening, or do I go see this once-in-a-lifetime speaking opportunity? And what may not surprise you is that 80% abandon the library, abandon their friends later on, and go to see this once-in-a-lifetime speech by a person that they've always admired. Now, a second group of students was asked to mentally simulate a slightly different scenario. They were also told about the library in the evening. They were also told that, going across campus, you see a sign for visiting speaker. But right next to that sign, for this group, they see another ad, and it's for a foreign film that's in very limited release right now, but has been creating a lot of buzz, and they've really been wanting to see this. And so now you've got two choices for your evening rather than the thing that you would have done before. Remember that before, 80% chose to go see the visiting speaker. So we might expect we would pick up an additional 10, 15, 20% that's going to do one of the other of these two attractive options. What actually happens is the number of people who do either of the two options drops. Right? More choices, more good choices, makes us less likely to do anything. All right? Now, this is a parable for those of you consulting on mission to your organizations. I talked to a hospital recently who had 11 different core values. Now, let me suggest that when you're making a critical decision, even though all 11 core values are really important and really good, you are not going to know which one to apply in this situation. I mean, maybe 3 you could wade through. In this case, 2, though, is substantially paralyzing people, two good options makes people less likely to choose. So back to the simple point. Southwest Airlines, all of us have seen case studies, read lots of articles about Southwest Airlines. Tremendously successful organization. There have been claims made that I find somewhat plausible that in the entire history of the airlines industry, investors have lost money. Anybody that has ever put money into the airlines industry has on average lost money from the time of the Wright brothers. Right? And it's kind of plausible because it's impossible to make money in industries where people are really passionate. So Hollywood movies are not a great place to make investments. Upscale wineries are not a good place to make investments. The Gallo region of the wine market is the profitable region. All right? But Southwest Airlines stands apart. At one point, Herb Kelleher, the CEO of Southwest Airlines, told a group of people, and he said this repeatedly over his tenure, I can teach you to be CEO of Southwest Airlines in 5 minutes. You want to hear? Here it is. This is one thing you need to know. Southwest is the low-fare airline. That's it. Now, here's a test for you. Tracy, flight attendant on the Houston to Las Vegas flight, comes to you and says, you know, this is kind of a long flight. And do you know what we're serving our customers on this flight? We're serving them peanuts. Right? How about we put together a nice chicken Caesar salad so that they have something to eat during this long flight? And Herb Kelleher turns to you and says, now what do you say to Tracy?
No.
You say, Tracy, will serving that chicken Caesar salad help Southwest become the low-fare airline? Because if it's not, then we're not serving any damn chicken Caesar salad. And you can see Herb Kelleher chain smoking, and drinking wild bourbon while he says that. All right. He wants to tell you that the right, simple message can guide lots of important actions. And notice what he's also just told you is that the customer is not always right. Not even close to always right. The strategy is always right. The right idea is always right. Mission creep is a tremendously important problem that afflicts the social sector, because the social sector is filled with needs that need to be met. And so it's easy for organizations over time to say, oh, well, there's good to do here, and there's good to do here, and there's good to do here. And we end up with an organization that is not really doing the best it could be doing at any of those things that it's trying to do. So the important point about simple is that simple overcomes decision paralysis. And one of the things that we should be doing in our lives and in our communication, and we can be helping the organizations that we're working with do, is to focus on what's really core to them in their mission. Urban legends are also unexpected. You only use 10% of your brain. I can't figure out any other reason that that idea circulates other than it's surprising to people. It's kind of interesting to talk about. Jaws on a spaceship, there's a planned idea, but it's also unexpected. If you'd said Jaws in Bermuda, Jaws in Hawaii, wherever they didn't film Jaws the first time, that wouldn't be unexpected. But putting it on a spaceship, that's kind of interesting. I'll teach you to be CEO in 5 minutes. That's an idea that gets your attention. City Year is an organization that does national youth service. Right? So they were the basis for the idea of AmeriCorps that Clinton signed into law. Now, here's how City Year describes their mission. We want to create the next generation of leaders for our democracy by bringing together a diverse group of youth for a year of national service. As mission statements go, that's not bad, right? I mean, we've got leaders, we've got democracy, we've got diversity, we've got service. Those are all powerful words and powerful concepts. But let's face it, this is exactly the kind of thing that you would expect City Year to say. Have they really grabbed you yet with that statement? Here's another thing that they say. We picture a world where one day the most common question asked of a 17-year-old in this country will be, where are you going to do your year of national service? Now, that works for me. That's a much more powerful statement, because what they've honed in on is an unexpected view of what the world could be like. And that's going to get your attention much more than the kind of standard generic sounding mission statement language that we're all trained to do in our organizations. The trick to being unexpected is to move beyond common sense to uncommon sense. We don't need to be spending our time talking to people about things that are common sense. Herb Kelleher could have told you Southwest is about being the low-fare airline. And you say, oh yeah, Herb, I've heard that for years. But when he says, I can teach you to be CEO in 5 minutes, this is it. That's the only idea you need. That's moving beyond common sense to uncommon sense. He's highlighting what's unexpected about his message by perhaps exaggerating, but saying, this is so important that if you understand this, you're all the way towards what I do as a CEO. There's another question, though, is like unexpected ideas not only get our attention, they keep our attention. Conspiracy theories in the natural environment are great at this. Gossip about Jennifer Aniston and Brad Pitt is great at doing this. It maintains our attention for a long period of time. How does that work in normal organizations? Well, Sony in 1952 was trying to build an organization post-World War II. So Tokyo was devastated. Here's a young organization being born in Tokyo. Now, they had a bright group of engineers and physicists and scientists. And the question is, how do you keep that group of people motivated and working together in a potentially demoralizing period? Here's the vision that kept them excited for the first 7 to 8 years of their existence as an organization. A pocketable radio. Now, to recognize how unexpected that idea was at the time, you have to remember that radio factories at the time employed cabinet makers. Radios were pieces of furniture. They were not something that you slip into your pocket. But as soon as you give people that vision, that unexpected vision, a really good scientist would say, well, that's interesting. There's that transistor technology that Bell Labs just introduced. If we could build something around that transistor technology, maybe we could shrink the radio down from this size to this size. And once we got it down to that size, so the wheels start to turn. The right unexpected idea can capture people's attention not just in the moment, but for a long period of time. Curiosity gaps hold interest. What would that be like? What would it take to get there? What would it take to build a pocketable radio? Urban legends are also very concrete. The vanishing hitchhiker legend that I told you about very often features the hitchhiker disappears after running out of the car onto the side of the road into a cemetery, and the driver of the car finds his or her sweater draped over a tombstone because earlier they had passed it across the back seat of the car to the hitchhiker. All right? Very concrete visual image. There's an urban legend that's very popular on college campuses these days about a kidney theft ring that leaves their victims floating in a bathtub full of ice with a note that says, call 911. Professional language, unfortunately, is not terribly concrete. Let's think about the nonprofit sector. Capacity building, mission-related, defer giving, social enterprise, scalability. Not a concrete idea among them. You're laughing at those guys. Think about your own organizations. All right? Medicine has its own jargon. If you've ever talked to a doctor, you know this. Here's my favorite. Idiopathic cardiomyopathy. Cardiomyopathy means something's wrong with your heart. Right? Idiopathic means we have no clue what it is. Now, when's the last time you heard a juicy piece of gossip? Right? Maybe this morning. When's the last time you heard a juicy piece of gossip about a performance metric? Probably never. We don't gossip about abstractions. We don't gossip about numbers. We don't gossip about things in our organizations that are at this very abstract general level. We gossip about real people doing real things. And so if we want our ideas to stick, we better think about how to make them concrete. Let me note that this is the single most, if you forget everything else about what I tell you this morning, this is the single most useful principle of making your ideas stick, is make things as tangible and concrete as you can. Let me give you an example. The Nature Conservancy in California. Nature Conservancy is interested in preserving places of ecological significance. This group in California at one point was preserving a set of fields in the middle of the state where there are these pools that form at certain times of the year after rainfall, and there are these tiny brine shrimp that arise from the muck and live and die when the pools decay, but they leave their eggs to be reborn. This is not charismatic megafauna. This is not pandas. It's not blue whales. It's not dolphins. It's brine shrimp, right? But they felt like it was ecologically important. Traditionally, the way that the Nature Conservancy has done this, and it's become one of the most successful nonprofit organizations anywhere, by telling donors, you give us money, we buy the land, and we protect it. Bucks and acres is what they call it within Nature Conservancy. You give us the bucks, we'll buy the acres, we preserve it. Very straightforward plan. At one point, California did an environmental assessment. And California is this really unusual place because it spans a great distance from south to north, right? So lots of temperate distances. It spans a distance from the ocean up into the mountains, so lots of kind of hierarchical elevation differences in climate. Because of the weather patterns, it's a Mediterranean climate region, which means lots of plants and animals grow here. All those things put together meant that when they did their assessment of the state and they colored in on their map the important areas that they wanted to preserve that were ecologically central, they found that they had colored in 40% of the state. Now you want to do bucks and acres with 40% of the state of California. 9% of it was in critical danger. So areas around Silicon Valley, areas around Los Angeles that were being kind of carved up by urban sprawl. How do you even start to motivate an organization to tackle a challenge like that? What the Nature Conservancy started thinking is, well, maybe we can't do bucks and acres only anymore. Maybe we better get involved in policy and setting policy for how land ought to be used. Maybe we ought to be getting involved not in buying stuff ourselves, but in putting together coalitions who can, preserve or deal with things. Again, you're starting to move your strategy to a much more abstract level, right? Because no longer can you have the enthusiasm as an employee of the Nature Conservancy of I buy land, I take it off the market, I protect it. Now all of a sudden we're putting together coalitions. We're sitting in Sacramento knocking on legislators' doors trying to make some progress on some issues. How do you make this concrete in a way that's going to motivate a set of employees and a set of donors who historically have given you money because you buy stuff? Well, how do we set goals? Here's one. 40% we want to save. How about 2% per year for 20 years? Break the goal down into measurable subunits. But it's still a little abstract. What does 2% mean? Let's make it more tangible by talking about it in terms of acreage. Well, here it is. 2 million acres a year. Does anybody have any clue what 2 million acres a year means? Right? It's a lot. It's a lot. But it's also not necessarily orienting people to the right thing. I mean, it's like telling a museum director, acquire 20 canvases a year, right? Without regard to the artist or the time period or the quality or anything. What did the Nature Conservancy end up doing? What they ended up doing is they started talking about landscapes. There were identifiable blobs on the map, but let's identify those blobs and start describing them to people. And let's start naming them. So there's an area around Silicon Valley, where most of us live. Those brown hills that you see on days when you can actually see the hills around Silicon Valley. So lots of grass, an occasional oak tree. It's called oak savanna. Not a tremendously exciting look. It's not like the redwoods, but it's tremendously important in terms of it serves as the water basin for the entire Bay Area. Right? And it turns out that it has a unique series of flora and fauna that live in this kind of oak savanna. What the Nature Conservancy did is they started talking about the Mount Hamilton Wilderness. And it turns out in that area of those brown hills, there is an area that is the size of Yosemite, that is one of the largest intact regions that are not subject to development in the entire state of California. Right? And as soon as they started talking about the Mount Hamilton Wilderness and describing the flora and the fauna and why it was important, other environmental groups around the Bay Area started writing the Mount Hamilton Wilderness into their action plans. Packard Foundation put a lot of money on the table. Greenbelt organizations started talking about saving the Mount Hamilton Wilderness. The Nature Conservancy people said, we'd always laugh when we heard that because we made this up. Right? But notice what they've done is they've turned an abstract blob of landmass into an actor. It's the Mount Hamilton Wilderness. And by making it that step more concrete, they managed to engage lots of other people with an idea that is now much stickier than it was before. Urban legends, and this is the biggest stretch, urban legends also are in perverse ways, very often, credible. There was a story that circulated in Seattle in the 1960s. So this is the height of the Cold War. There is atomic testing that is going on in the Pacific Oceans. So we're testing out nuclear weapons. And according to this rumor, the fallout from those atomic tests is being picked up by the Pacific trade winds, wafting over the Pacific Ocean, and then coming down and dropping in Seattle. Right? That's a pretty scary image. And the way that the rumor said you could verify this for yourself is that this fallout is so toxic that it actually pits the windshields of cars. Okay? And sure enough, people started looking at their car windshields, and there are these really tiny pits. Now, it turns out auto technology at the time was such that if you drive your car for a while, your windshield develops tiny pits from having little dust particles and rocks and stuff kind of floating. But normally you're looking through your windshield. You're not looking at your windshield, right? What's interesting is that urban legends and rumors regularly evolve these kind of little tests that people can perform for themselves. And in the book we call those testable credentials. Now, how is this relevant for you? Well, let me give you an example from politics. Ronald Reagan in 1980 was running against the incumbent Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan had been governor of California, but he was, to a lot of Americans, a fairly scary figure. Didn't know if he was a little too conservative for the country. But Jimmy Carter had presided over 4 years where we had substantial domestic problems and international problems. Domestically, it was an era of stagflation. So you hear that term occasionally these days, an era of high inflation but stagnant growth, unemployment. Right? So domestically, it looked like the economy was in tough shape. Internationally, a very young Ted Koppel was starting to make his career with a new show called Nightline that was counting up the number of days that U.S. hostages had been held by the revolutionary government in Iran. Right? So internationally, big setback. Ronald Reagan, in concluding his debates with Jimmy Carter, could have pointed to a lot of facts and statistics about the economy, about the position of the United States in the world. Here's how he closed his final speech of the final debate. He said, I want you to ask yourself tonight, am I better off today than I was 4 years ago? Now, if your answer to this question is yes, then I think your choice in the election is clear. But if your answer to this question is no, then you have another choice. And I would like to ask for your vote for President of the United States. Notice what he's done. He's outsourced credibility to the viewers. He's given them a testable credential. Now, if I were trying to improve on what he did, testable credential part is good. I don't like the self-interest part, because it turns out that political scientists tell us that people actually don't vote their own personal situation. They don't vote their pocketbooks. Right? People vote other people's pocketbooks. People vote the state of the economy. People vote the status of the country. Right? So if Ronald Reagan had said, ask yourself, are we better off today than we were 4 years ago? I think that would be a complete home run. But notice that what he's done is he's allowed people to test a claim for themselves to establish credibility. And the problem is that in a world of spin, people might not believe our facts, our details, our authorities. And so an important thing to keep in mind is, can I allow people to test something for themselves? Now, a lot of times credibility is about, fundamentally credibility is about believability. Do people believe our message? An important subset of believability is, do people believe that change is possible? And that's a central task of all of the organizations that you're dealing with. They're tackling big, important problems. And the question is, do we believe that big, important problems are actually solvable, or are they too big? Here's an example from Bill McDonough. He's an architect and designer who's become famous for claiming that what's good for the environment can be good for business. Now, that's a pretty unexpected idea. It's not necessarily believable. Business people aren't predisposed to believe that they can do something good for the environment without absorbing high cost for their own organization. So here's a story that Bill McDonough tells. He describes a Swiss textile firm. There's a high chance that they made the fabrics that you're sitting on right now. But because of the dyeing process for fabrics, a lot of the chemicals in dyes are carcinogens. Lead and mercury and nickel and all kinds of things that make the colors in fabrics. And in fact, the Swiss government had declared that the trimmings of this fabric production process, the trimmings of the bolts of cloth that Rohnert Textile were forming into furniture, had declared that hazardous waste. Now, Bill McDonough says, it doesn't take a genius to realize that if the trimmings from the bolts of cloth are hazardous waste, but you're selling what's in the middle. All right, you get the idea. So Rohnert Textile says, we have a problem. Can you help us with this? So Bill McDonough and his collaborator started out with 8,000 chemicals in common use in the fabric dye industry. And they started subjecting them to a series of screens. We don't want any chemicals with known carcinogenic properties, mutagenicity properties. They had a bunch of screens that I can't even pronounce. All right? But they said, we want chemicals that you could eat and be safe. All right? They eliminated 7,962. But with the remaining 38, you could dye every color in the spectrum other than black. They started reorganizing the production process at this chemical factory around these 38 chemicals. The first savings is that factory workers no longer had to wear bulky protective stuff in order to do things. The number of safeguards and checks for the production process went down dramatically. Their cost went down by 15%. Okay? And now, instead of declaring the trimmings hazardous waste, Rohnert Textile was able to sell them to gardeners in Switzerland as mulch for gardens. All right? So that's pretty nice. Swiss inspectors that came to test the new factory hooked up their water testing instruments that detect trace metals and all those kind of things to the outflow of the plant. They started tapping on them. Then they took them and went to the inflow and plugged them in, and they're getting normal Swiss drinking water readings with normal trace elements of, minerals and chemicals and that kind of stuff. The water factory had become a water purification plant. They thought their machines were broken because they couldn't detect even normal levels of chemicals and minerals in the outflow. Bill McDonough says, what if industrial factories can double as water purification plants? Note the specific details that he's just given you in that stories. 7,962 failures. You can make every color but black. The broken water meter of the Swiss inspectors. Those add credibility to that story. They're not abstractions. They're not saying you can turn an industrial chemical plant into a water purification plant. Nobody would believe that. But after hearing this story and after hearing these details, we're more predisposed to believe. But more importantly, the story as a whole stands in for what we call in the book the Sinatra test. After Frank Sinatra's New York, New York, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere, right? If you can go into Rohnert Textile and make the changes that you did, lower cost, turn it into a water purification plant, then there's hope for a lot of people. And so finding the Sinatra test story for your organization, for your context, for your project, may be an important thing to do. Give people enough belief, enough credibility that they're going to listen to your message and your plans for what the organization should be doing. Urban legends are also emotional. Now, the problem is that urban legends tend to specialize in negative emotions, fear, disgust, anger. What if we wanted more positive emotions? And in particular, when we talk about emotions, what we don't necessarily want to limit ourselves to is these kind of feelings that we have, like fear or like joy. What we're really talking about is how do we get people to care? That's really the emotion that we care about. It's like how do we get people to care one way or the other about the thing that we're talking to them about. I grew up in Texas, and it turns out that Texas is a big state. It has lots of roads. And traditionally, the roads have had lots of litter. Now, how do you get a purchase on the roadside litter problem in the state of Texas? Well, the first thing that you do is you hire a litter researcher. And the litter researcher samples random highways and goes down the highway clicking clickers for various kinds of litters. There's a fast food wrapper, there's a snuff can, there's a beer can, there's another fast food wrapper. And you develop over time a demographic profile of your customer. And here's your customer. 18 to 30-year-old truck driving males. They affectionately called this person Bubba. So here's the question. How do you get Bubba to care about roadside litter in Texas? Now, there are two things that you need to know about Texans that might give you leverage in this. Well, actually, let me pause that for a second. Let me give you a couple of options. How do you get Bubba to care about roadside litter? Woodsy owl. Give a hoot, don't pollute. It worked for me as a kid. All right, here's another option. You don't like that one? Weeping Native Americans. Right. Bubbas like to make people cry. Right. Here's another one. Fines for roadside litter. Let's raise them. Bubba doesn't have a lot of pocket change. There aren't enough police in Texas, it turns out, to monitor all the roadways. Right? So you raise the fine, Bubba's going to feel like he's getting away with something bigger. It turns out that the organization that started tackling this problem put two piles of money of about the same size aside when they started tackling this problem. One was a pile of money that was devoted to increasing enforcement, to changing all the signs that say what roadside fines are, to putting more police on the roadways, to monitor stretches that were littered very often. So that's one pool of money. The second pool of money they're going to put towards a campaign. But we still haven't gotten a very clear idea of what that campaign might look like. Now, here are two things that might help you. One is to realize that Texans are very patriotic people. Not necessarily patriotic about the United States, although that is certainly true, but Texas at one point was its own nation. And Texans kind of think that maybe it should go back to doing that. All right? The rest of the nation kind of thinks that maybe it should go back. The second thing that you have to realize is that Texans believe that Texas is beautiful. Now, we're wrong about that. But those are two important facts that this group of people thought that they could leverage. So here was the campaign that they came up with. Don't mess with Texas. They would have country and western music stars. You all know Willie Nelson, prototypical Texan. He's going to stand up and say, if you litter, you're messing with Texas. Don't mess with Texas. You have obscure figures that most of you might not recognize. So Too Tall Jones and Randy White, longtime defensive people for the Dallas Cowboys. They stand up and say, you mess with Texas, you mess with roadways, you're messing with Texas. Don't mess with Texas. All right? So sports heroes, country and western music stars, prototypical Texans telling you if you're littering on the roads, you're messing with Texas. You're messing with our identity. You're not patriotic. All right, how did it work? First year of the campaign, roadside litter dropped 30%. Within 3 years, the amount of roadside litter had dropped 82%. And you remember that pool of money that they had set aside for enforcement? They never spent any of it. This was a pure identity appeal. Yeah. They were the people that were hiring the ad agency that came up with this specific campaign. I actually don't know. So the point here is that there are two ways of getting people to care. One is the way that we were all trained to think about in business school. Consequences. Economics. Change the costs and benefits. You raise the fines. $500. Right? The second route, though, and I think this is more important in a lot of situations, is the identity route. You make people care by tapping into something that they care about in their picture of themselves. Texans care about being patriotic, so tap into that. Show them that Texans don't litter. Final principle is that urban legends, not surprisingly, in a lot of cases, come in the form of stories. I do an exercise in my elective on how to make ideas stick, where I ask MBA students to make a speech. I give them 1 minute to argue either that property crime is or isn't a really significant problem for the United States. I give them some background information from the Department of Justice. It turns out in the typical speech, an MBA can work in 2.5 statistics. Only 1 person in 10 tells a story. After the speeches are all done, I bring people back in to the class and I give them an opportunity to distract themselves by watching a Monty Python video. They don't know why I'm playing it, but for about 10 minutes I distract them. And then I ask them what they can remember of all the speeches that they just heard in their small group of 7 or 8 people. And it turns out that they don't remember very much. But if we extrapolate it to a group of 100 listeners, for every statistic that somebody quotes, 5 people out of 100 would remember that statistic. 60 people out of 100 would remember the story. Now, I realize the irony of starting to tell you about stories by quoting a statistic. But I want the right-brained among you to have faith in what I'm about to say.
But it's in the context of a story.
It's in the context of a story. The World Bank is an organization that loans out money in developing nations. They build roadways, they build schools, they build water purification plants. Those are the loans that they give out. At one point, a man named Steve Denning had made his way up pretty high up in the World Bank. He was running the Africa portfolio, which is about 40% of the World Bank's business. But his mentor left the organization. His mentor's mentor that was running the World Bank got booted out in a political struggle. And so it's one of those uncomfortable organizational situations where your group that was running the organization is now turned over. And so Steve Denning is demoted from the head of the Africa portfolio and told to go off and think about knowledge management. Now he says this is the equivalent of being sent to corporate Siberia because nobody at the World Bank cares about knowledge management. We don't do knowledge management, they would tell him when he went around talking to them. We're a bank. We loan money. So here's a problem. How do you get people at the World Bank to start thinking about knowledge management? Because Steve Denning's saying, we really do know lots of things. We not only make loans, we actually watch how those loans unfold. We know what kind of roadway technology builds effective roads that hold up over time. We know what water purification plant designs work and don't work. We have a lot of knowledge. So here's a pitch. Suppose that we went around and gave people a definition that would give their attention about knowledge management. Knowledge management caters to critical issues of organizational survival, adaptation, and competence in the face of increasingly discontinuous change. All right, so that's not working for you. What Steve Denning found is that, like you predicted, the definitions weren't working. The PowerPoints weren't working. People started to pay attention when he would start throwing in a story. And here's a story. In June of 1995, a health worker in Kamana, Zambia, logged onto the CDC website in Atlanta and got the answer to a question on how to treat malaria. And he would say, there's some interesting things about this story. One is that this is not 1999. This is not the height of the internet, the dot-com boom. This is 1995, 5 years before the internet was really on people's radar screens. The second thing to notice is this is not the capital of Zambia. This is Kamana, a small town several hundred miles from the capital. And the third thing to note is that the World Bank is not in this story. The CDC in Atlanta has its information out on the website so people can benefit from it. We know a lot about building roadways and building water purification plants. What would it be like if we had our information available to people and we could leverage the power of our loans by making sure that people were doing the right things with the money that we give them? He was called onto the carpet at one point by the new regime, the executive team, for an annual meeting. He was given 12 minutes on the agenda of the day to make his case for knowledge management. And during that, he told this story. He said at the break, immediately 2 members of the executive committee came over to him saying, why aren't we moving faster on this thing? And they started reeling off things that they were going to go back and doing in their organization to go on this knowledge management training. He said, my first reaction was, these people have stolen my idea. And he said, my second reaction was, how wonderful. These people have stolen my idea. Right? Notice that there is a power in that story that did not exist in the definition. You had to kind of understand what knowledge management was already in order to understand the definition, right? But this story suddenly gave you a little hint of what the world might be like. And Steve Denning wrote a brilliant book called The Springboard Story. The Springboard is the title of the book. And he talks about springboard stories being things that give a jumping off place for other people to think about their own issues. He said, notice that story that I told was a bad story. I didn't tell you about the healthcare worker. I didn't tell you how many kids he or she had. I didn't tell you what they had for breakfast. No details, no context, no anything. He said there was a reason for that. I didn't want you to be thinking about my story. I wanted you to be thinking about your story. while I was telling about this healthcare worker, I wanted you thinking in your own organization, wow, what if we had our information about roadways up on the web like the CDC has? Right? And a springboard story, he says, is mass customization. I can tell one springboard story, and in a crowd of 66 people, I've got 66 people spinning their own story along with it. All right, so we're coming to the end of the presentation, so let me just concede that what I've told you in the last 45 minutes is not rocket science. So here's the question. Why are there not more brilliantly designed ideas? And here's the punchline that I anticipated at the start. Turns out that there's a phenomenon called the curse of knowledge, well researched in psychology. And what it says is that when we know something very well, when we become experts in a domain, and notice that expertise is good, right? We come up with solutions because we're experts. The problem is that when you are experts in a domain, you immediately become crippled in your ability to talk about that thing to others. Right? If you've ever talked to a doctor about anything, you've been on the other side of the curse of knowledge. If you've ever had an IT person come in and try to tell you what to do with your computer, you've been on the other side of the curse of knowledge. If you've ever talked to a 12-year-old about their favorite video game, you've been on the other side of the curse of knowledge. Right? Experts know what they're doing. But because they think about the world in a more complex, abstract way, they have trouble getting that information across to the rest of us. Now notice that systematically, expertise causes problems for us. Good communication, effective messages, sticky messages are simple. Experts think in terms of complexity. Experts think in terms of nuance. Good messages are concrete. Well, one of the definitional features of expertise is you think about the world in a more general, abstract kind of way. Good communication comes in the form of stories, but experts spend their time trying to write the perfect definition, the perfect set of requirements for a given idea. So what all of those things say is that if we want to make our messages stick, we're going to be in a position where we have to overcome the curse of knowledge, and the checklist that we've been talking about may be a good way to start doing that. Close with one final story. We teach at Stanford a program with national art strategies. And so we'll go into a community, Kansas City or Cleveland or Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and talk to a group of arts organizations for 3 days. We teach them a mini strategy course. We do industry analysis. We do strategy statements. We do a mission framework. And at the end of the first day and a half, people take all those frameworks and they apply them to their own organization. And so one of the organizations that we saw in Miami, Fort Lauderdale was the Murray Drainoff Duo Piano Group. And as part of their mission statement exercise, they were supposed to write down a Collins and Porras inspiring purpose statement for their organization that's going to engage the motivations of employees, it's going to engage donors, it's going to engage people that might volunteer for them. And here's what they had in that box. We exist to protect, preserve, and promote the music of duo piano. Are you inspired yet? All right, so people in the crowd started talking to them about their organization. And these are arts managers, right? They're saying, not quite getting it yet, why is it important to protect, preserve, and promote the music of duo piano? And they said, well, there's just not a lot of duo piano music being done anymore. And about that time, my mental image of duo piano was there are some bars that you can go to where people come out and bang out show tunes at, two pianos on opposite ends of the bar and have sing-alongs and that kind of stuff. That was my picture of duo piano. And I was thinking to myself, well, maybe there is a reason that duo piano music is not being done a lot anymore. So finally one of the arts people, and I couldn't have gotten away with doing this as a business school professor, but one of the arts people said, look, let me be really blunt. Why would the world be a less rich, engaging place if duo piano music just disappeared off the face of the earth? And that kind of took them aback. And they started thinking about, well, how do we explain this to outsiders? And they said, well, the piano is this magnificent instrument. It was created to put the entire range and tonal quality of the whole orchestra under the control of one performer. And so when you get two of these magnificent instruments in the same room, and the performers can build on what each other are doing and harmonize with each other, it's like having the sound of the orchestra, but the intimacy of chamber music. And when they said that, everybody in the room kind of rocked back. And for the first time, a group of arts people thought, maybe I need to hear duo piano music. Because if duo piano music disappears, I'll never have that unexpected, concrete, juxtaposed experience of having the sound of the orchestra, but the intimacy of chamber music. Now, why did it take 7 minutes of relentless and rude questioning to get a group of people who had devoted their lives to duo piano to tell us why we should care about duo piano? And we're back to the curse of knowledge. It's hard to create messages that stick because in the cases where we most care about our messages, in the cases where we most have something to say, we are cursed by our knowledge in a way that prevents us from articulating that knowledge to other people. So it's hard to create messages that stick. Next time, I want you to think urban legend style success. Thank you.